Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers and subscribers of the World Muslim Community Council. Welcome to our weekly lecture, and on this beautiful Saturday evening in Abu Dhabi time. Today, we had the honor to have Professor Maha Mirza from University of Notre Dame, Indiana South Bend. Professor Maha Mirza is a teaching professor of Islam and science in the Kew School of Global Affairs and executive director of Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion in the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Mirza previously served as a lead faculty in a project to advance scientific and theoretical literacy in Madrasa discourse in Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, which is a very famous program actually, involve Muslims and scholars and religious leaders from many parts of the world. And before that, Professor Mahan served as Dean of Faculty as the famous Muslim college in the US, Zaytuna College. I think many of our audience here are familiar with this, the first accredited Muslim college in the US in California. Professor Maha holds a BS degree in mechanical engineering from UT Austin, MA degree from Hartford Seminary in Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim relations, and a PhD in religious studies from Yale University. He has taught a range of courses in Arabic Islamic studies, Western religions, and history of science, along with foundational subjects in the liberal arts, including logic, rhetoric, ethics, and politics. As you see from this introduction, his expertise is very vast and very diverse, versatile. And his doctorate research was on the intellectual world of al-Biruni, a 11th century scientist from Central Asia. And he also edited 2 special issues of a Muslim World and serves as assistant director for Princeton Encyclopedia of Islamic Political Thought, in which I was also honored to contribute one piece some years ago. So based on Professor Maha Mirza's specialty, you see, we have very honored to have him to give a topic called Islam and Our New Cosmic Story, which really nicely fit in his expertise and his observation about how Muslims and Islamic scholars and students of Islamic studies today, how we should look at this great tradition of Islam. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Maha Mirza to give us a lecture today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Shaojin, for your kind introduction, and to the World Muslim Communities Council for inviting me to present these thoughts today. It's really an honor to be participating in this forum. I'd also like to acknowledge a number of these ideas come out of the Madrasa Discourses program that we developed with Professor Ibrahim Musa at Notre Dame. And some ideas also reflect some of the thinking that we did at Zaytuna as we were building the Liberal Arts College. However, what is presented here is mainly my synthesis. I give credit to them, but I don't want to give them any blame for shortcomings or errors that might be perceived. And I don't represent, them here. So just hold me alone accountable. Let me share my screen so we can get started. All right. So the title of this talk is Islam and Our New Cosmic Story. And that presumes that there was at some point an old cosmic story. And there are actually many stories, both in the past and in the present. But I essentialize here in part for ease of understanding. So my presentation will have the following parts. I want to start by saying a few words about identity, and I'll speak to the identity of both individuals and the complexity of identity, but also try to touch upon then how identities of cultures and civilizations and Islamic civilization is also more complex rather than simple. And that'll take us into conceptualizing tradition. And I'll give us one way to do that. There are many ways in which this is done, but I'll give us one way to help us conceptualize tradition for the purpose of our conversation today. And then the classical worldview, which may be the old cosmic story, will be what I will speak to next. And I'll bring that into conversation with our new cosmic story. So I'll build up to that. And that raises for us a number of big questions, like really big questions that I don't propose to answer in this forum by any means, but I'll pose them. And I think that engaging those questions is a civilizational project, and perhaps even a generational one, intergenerational one. And then I'll conclude to make sure we've got all our ducks in a row, and hopefully there'll be some time for question and answers. So let me turn to identity. What makes me, me? Right, there's a kind of essentialism here. And everyone can think about this for themselves. You can think about what makes you, you, or what makes anything, anything. But it's easy to do with persons, and particularly with ourselves. So first of all, it's my gender. I'm a male. And when I walk into a setting, I'm identified as a male. I behave according to how males are expected to behave in particular settings. This becomes more important in perhaps religious settings or in Islamic settings, but also in other places like restrooms, for example. Which room do I go into? So it regulates my behavior. Women will have a different experience in the world than men. And then there's the issue of race. I am, brown, South Asian. So some might immediately recognize me as colored. I'm in the United States, not white. And depending on where you are in time and place, that can have a huge impact on your life. So we've seen the recent demonstrations around police brutality in the United States, in the George Floyd incident. And so race is very much salient when a police officer approaches an individual. The race often determines how they feel about that encounter, and that conditions their behavior. Class. So I might be, a certain gender and a certain race, but class is a whole nother category. And so I have a friend who is brown like me, and he was in a first class lounge once, and people didn't think he belonged there. And he also had other attributes like a very long beard. Perhaps he was dressed traditionally. And so he had some awkward moments that he had to deal with to explain to them, no, I do belong here, because there's a classification in society. Now, religion. This is something that's not immediately apparent. It can be if you dress in a certain way. There are certain markers for religion. But all of these things make up our identities, also nationality. So I have now an American passport. I'm also a dual citizen, a Pakistani. But depending on which passport I pull out, I have a certain identity. And that opens up certain doors for me here, closes other doors for me over there. So we can think about identity as something that's very complex. And I'm drawing on the anthropologist Kwame Anthony Appiah, who thinks and writes about identity. This is one of his latest books, The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity. And why does he call it the lies that bind? Well, identities have, he gives us these four sort of theoretical categories. So it's a label. In some places, if I'm labeled a male, like in feminist discourses, then I have a certain positionality, and that positionality makes demands on me, or vice versa. When the female label is one that's most prominent, so it makes demands on your behavior as in yourself, but also others demand a certain kind of and expect a certain kind of behavior. Labels put boundaries around us. And so who is a member of this particular category of identity and who is outside? And obviously, when you have boundaries, you have definitions, hudud, and those are always contested on the basis of power. And so who's inside, who's outside, how do you position yourself vis-a-vis other identities? So I began with this reflection on identity because I want to think about Islam as well in similar terms. Now, here's a quote by a wonderful scholar in the United States, Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah, and he wrote an article called Islam and the Cultural Imperative. And he writes, in history, Islam showed itself to be culturally friendly, and in that regard has been likened to a crystal clear river. Its waters, that is Islam's waters, are pure, sweet, and life-giving. They have no color of their own. Emphasis. Islam's waters have no color of their own. They reflect the bedrock, the indigenous culture over which they flow. In China, Islam looked Chinese. In Mali, it looked African. You can say the same about South Asian. And this is why we gravitate when there's a big community to a mosque that represents our own culture. We feel more comfortable. Speaking from the United States perspective. Sustained cultural relevance to distinct peoples, diverse places, and different times underlay Islam's long success as a global civilization. And I want to highlight here, having no color of their own, Islam's waters. I want to say here that already when we say its waters, there's a plural. And I know that here it's implied that its waters as in a geographical plurality. But I want to say that there's actually more to it than that the water itself has a different flavor. They are different waters. And I want to turn to, I titled this Tainted Waters. Maybe you can say flavored. I should have used the word flavored. Now I'm thinking about it. So replace in your mind flavored rather than tainted, because tainted implies something negative. So flavored waters. And I turned to Professor Dimitri Gutas, who wrote this wonderful book in 1998, Greek Thought and Arabic Culture, on the Greco-Arabic translation movement. And he says, a century and a half of Greco-Arabic scholarship has amply documented that from about the middle of the 8th century to the end of the 10th century, almost all, that's his emphasis in the original, all non-literary and non-historical secular Greek books that were available throughout the Eastern Byzantine Empire and the Near East were translated into Arabic. So you got a certain flavoring to the water, okay? And this kind of flavoring, which maybe we use the term hybridity. Here's a beautiful quote by Edward Said, which Professor Gutas has used to begin his book with. But he draws from one of Edward Said's works called On Culture and Imperialism. He says, this is Said, partly because of empire, all cultures are involved in one another. So when we're speaking of identity, Islam, a pure Islam versus the West, that's an oversimplification. Islam and West are co-imbricated, especially in the past. This is why Islam is taught as a Western religion. All cultures are involved in one another. None is single and pure. All are hybrid, heterogeneous, extraordinarily differentiated, and unmonolithic. Okay? They're not one simple thing. And so in the book, he talks about this. He says all these non-literary secular Greek works were translated, and he enumerates them: astrology and alchemy, and the rest of the occult sciences. The subjects of the quadrivium, quantitative reasoning, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and theory of music. The entire field of Aristotelian philosophy throughout its history: metaphysics, ethics, physics, zoology, botany, and especially logic, the organon, all the health sciences, medicine, pharmacology, and veterinary science, and various other marginal genres of writing, such as Byzantine handbooks on military science, the Tactica, popular collections of wisdom sayings, and even books on falconry. So this huge corpus was absorbed into Islam, and Islam processed it and made it part of itself. And so when often we talk about going back to a pure Islam, we're already talking about a flavored Islam, and an Islam that was flavored in a classical, I would say, philosophical and scientific worldview, which I'll speak to in a moment. But I want us to, before then, say just a word about tradition. So when we think of tradition, most people think of transmission. So there are certain things from the past that are passed down. And in an Islamic sense, they're passed down in a certain way through authentic lines of transmission from people who are considered reliable. And these are scholars who have been accepted by their peers in every generation as being worthy of both representing, harboring, teaching, and then passing down the tradition to the next generation. And often this kind of way of thinking of tradition is associated with schools of thought. So you have a Hanafi tradition, you have a Maliki tradition, you have a Shafi'i and Hanbali tradition, or a Ja'fari tradition, you have Ibadism, and then you can go into the theological traditions, the philosophical traditions. And so there are multiple traditions within tradition. But what I want to do is I'm going to draw on this scholar. This is from the Western. This is by no means exclusive, but for our purpose, I think it's helpful to think of tradition as a great conversation, not just authentic lines of transmission. Because there you have the label of identity, Hanafi, in group, and the others are out group, and there's contestations between Hanafis and Shafi'is, for example. But I want to think of us inclusively, the Hanafi-Shafi'i conversation as tradition, for example, and then beyond that, the conversation between the theologians, mutakallimun, and the falasifa as tradition. That conversation, not one school, and so on. And so he says, this is the first volume in what they call the Great Books collection in Western civilization, the Great Conversation, and they identify great ideas around which there has been a conversation, and then great books that represent those ideas. And he says, this is Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was the president of University of Chicago for a long time, one of the youngest deans at Yale Law School in the early 20s, mid 20s, mid 1920s, mid 20th century. So 1920s, to 1950s is when he was very active. It is the task, he says, of every generation to reassess the tradition in which it lives. Every generation. To discard what it cannot use, because it's for us to use. We've got to make it work, and it's got to make sense. To discard what it cannot use and to bring into context with the distant and intermediate past the most recent contributions to the great conversation. So there's so much in this quote, but first of all, it doesn't stay static. There's an element that comes from the past that we inherit, but we reassess it, and then we add to it. And so tradition is something that is living and dynamic. And I want us to think about our tradition through this great conversation. And I put, just as a way of example, this is a conversation that I'm familiar with. There are many conversations. And you can see I put the names of Ibn Sina, al-Biruni, Imam al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah. So what's going on here? This is Al-As'ila wal-Ajwiba. It's a book on questions and answers between al-Biruni and Ibn Sina. I worked on this not exclusively, but in part for my dissertation. And Biruni and Ibn Sina, they both come from Central Asia. They were in Bukhara, probably, or Biruni may come from just outside Khiva in Uzbekistan. They may have met, they may not have met, but at least they were young contemporaries. And Biruni asked Ibn Sina a set of questions. The questions are on, guess what? Aristotelian cosmology. You see what's impacting Islamic thought. Are these questions about the structure of the heavens, how they work, what drives them, and how we relate to them. And they disagree. So it's a conversation. And according to, the philosophical understanding, the universe consists of these elements, and I'll say more about this in a second, 4 elements in classical philosophy: earth, fire, air, water, and then another realm beyond the moon of ether. Earth, fire, air, water go naturally up and down. So it's in the nature of earth to move to the center of the universe. That's in its earthy nature. It moves according to its nature. It's a natural motion. But it's in the nature of the heavens to move not up and down, but in circular motion. And circular motion is a kind of perfection, because linearity is up and down. Maybe you say up is better than down. It is goal oriented. There's an end point. So maybe before you're at rest, you're not in the perfect location. And so with a circular motion, you don't have that. The heavens are always moving in a circle, and there's no end point. They're always moving from one point back to the same point. Any way you move them, there is no end. It's perfection. And so Al-Biruni asked, for example, one of the questions, Ibn Sina, he says, why do you say the movements are essential, part of the natures of these things? Why can't we imagine them as being forced? So, for example, the heavier elements just displace the lighter ones. And they're not naturally moving in these ways. And so the questions were not resolved, but it was a very interesting conversation. Al-Ghazali comes along. He has another conversation with the philosophers. And he asks a different set of questions more related to theology and the nature of God. And he says in his Tahafut al-Falasifa that, look, the philosophers get many things wrong, but 3 things they especially get wrong about the nature of God, because the God they describe is too different from the God of Scripture. We cannot accept it. And so he writes this book. I'm not going to get into the points, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. What I'm trying to get at is that this is all part of tradition. This is tradition, the conversation. Ibn Rushd comes along and he looks at Ghazali and says, no. You are the one who didn't understand. He writes at-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence. And he says, especially on these 3 points, you've completely misunderstood the philosophers. And here's how you can, here's what the philosophers were really saying. And here's how you can reconcile it with theology. Now, one of the things Ibn Rushd does is he emphasizes the use of logic, which Ghazali does too. All of them do. So logic is the art of arts, the art of reasoning. and systematic reasoning. And so they argue in its favor. And that's something they share, but they apply it differently and they come to different conclusions. And they're being criticized by those who don't maybe look at logic, especially when it's in its Greek instantiation in the Arabic world, because they said it represents Greek language and Greek grammar that's foreign to us. We should have our own native, systems of thinking. And why do you listen to these foreigners anyways? We have Islam. And so Ibn Rushd says, this is in another one of his books, Al-Fasl al-Maqal. He says, why do you disparage logic? Think of it like an ala. It's a tool. It's neutral, like a knife. You know, when you buy a knife, you use it as a tool, and you want a sharp knife that cuts well. And so when you go to the market, you don't ask if a Greek merchant is selling you the knife or if an Arab Muslim merchant is selling you the knife. You ask if the knife is sharp. And then you buy the sharpest knife, and so you used to cut it. And so logic is the sharpest knife for our minds and gives us the best and most systematic reasoning. And that's why we use it. End of story. But Ibn Taymiyyah says, no, hold on. This doesn't really work. Because fine, you can use logic and you use a kind of formal reasoning in order to give definitions, use them in propositions and terms, and then to arrange them in arguments that give you valid conclusions. And but it's circular because you're the one who defines the terms. And so obviously what you have in mind is how you're going to articulate your definition, and then that's how you're going to use it in your argument. So there's a circularity there. And he says it's useful, but certainly not for theology, because theology deals with the unseen world. You have no reference for it other than scripture. And so stick to scripture when it comes to theology, and don't rationalize it based on categories that you impose upon it with your limited mind. So logic has limited use. Now, these are all very interesting arguments, and this is all part of our tradition. And we quote so many of these figures when we speak about the greatness of Islam, but we forget that they often didn't see eye to eye with each other. They argued with each other. They refuted each other. In some cases, they were at each other's throats, but they're part of the same one and the same tradition and conversation. And it's inflected by a flavor. It's flavored by ways of thinking that were not native to Islam, but that Islam encountered as it went out into the world. Okay, this is natural. Now, I come to my third part of the presentation, the worldview and classical worldview. I drew a lot on, it's an introductory book, but I think it's very helpful to the history and philosophy of science. I recommend it highly. He says a worldview is not merely a collection of separate, independent, unrelated beliefs. So I believe this about the heavens, but I believe this about religion, and I believe that about moral values, and I believe this about politics. No. Worldviews are related. They're intertwined, interrelated, interconnected system of beliefs is a worldview. Okay? And one of the things I want to argue is, despite the differences within Islam, the conversation was taking place within a certain scientific and philosophical worldview. Whether you accepted it or rejected it, you had to deal with its terms. Okay? And here's an image that I put before you to represent that world. I put links underneath. This is from the University of Oregon. I thought it was particularly useful as I was looking around images. I don't necessarily endorse, everything on these websites or have not browsed them or studied them in great detail, where I don't give any link. I got it from open source. So I looked up something like Wikipedia, which you can just use, and if the image was helpful. So this image here shows this worldview that we're talking about, within which Muslims were thinking, and this is the worldview in which wahi to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ comes. The earth is at the center. In a perfect world, maybe, or in a natural world, all the earthy things move down. Then they have the water. Then you have the water. Then you have the air, and then you have fire. Okay. So this is the natural world, and then beyond that you have the moon, and then you have the heavens. And you can see that beyond the moon is a completely different realm of circular motion. Underneath the moon, you have linear motion with elements going up and down. And these elements, they have certain qualities. And then our place on Earth, we have certain positioning with respect to the stars. And all of those things have influences on our lives. Classical thought reflected on this to no end. Okay, different dimensions of this picture of the world. Here are the elements. Now the elements, you can see that they have certain qualities. They can be hot, wet, cold, dry. And I know you're thinking of traditional medicine now. And so the physical theories contributed to our thinking of, biological theories and the discipline of medicine. And we also know that people have different temperaments. And so I picked this chart here as something to show us that when you're young, certain kinds of, you have certain kind of elemental dominance with air, and it makes you warm and moist. Sanguine in temperament, you're active, you're alive, you're jovial, maybe you're optimistic, right? But then, you reach youth and you become choleric, become demanding, maybe a little bit impatient, so you're warm and dry. And then, you go into further adulthood and you become melancholic, kind of pensive and thoughtful. And then in old age, you're phlegmatic, calm, cold and moist, perhaps wise. And so these, when you have to be treated, you have to keep in mind your age. You have to do all kinds of analysis to see, if you have too much moisture or if you're too much warmth, and then you feed the person with something to balance that. And this is how traditional medicine works. And what I'm trying to say here is that the theories about the nature of the world and the stars and the human body are all connected. And this also led to a kind of, astrology, because we know that the heavens influence the earth. We know this even today, right? Just look at the moon. It causes the tides. And so the sun gives us the seasons. And so if these two large heavenly bodies can influence the world, why not all the other stars? It's a very rational conclusion. And so this is one of the reasons why they looked into astrology and tried to see if certain concurrences between what's in the heavens, constellations, and the moon and the sun, when they aligned with, certain things on Earth, can you see certain patterns? Is there a science here that we just need to, if we look hard enough, we can identify? Now, obviously, because it dealt with issues of, qadar, and the ulama found this to be a problematic science. You're trying to just kind of divine people's destinations through the stars. And we know that qadar comes from Allah. And so, but nonetheless, this was the package of the world. And in that worldview, we operated. Our intellectual tradition operated. Even the science of the virtues, right? Whether your temperament is, if you're a virtuous person or non-virtuous person, It could have to do with your physical constituency. And so I'm going to give you a few elements of this classical scientific worldview. First of all, it's static. It was created, and then it is. And the philosophers talked about how, you know, the things are always the way they are. The heavens are in perfect motion. So it's not evolving, let's say it that way. It's hierarchical. You have two realms. Things work differently in the heavens than they do on earth. On earth, there's generation and corruption, kaun and fasad. In the heavens, it's perfection. And so there's also a kind of dualism of matter and form. Is that connected to the structure of the universe, where matter is the material things that come and go, but the ideas, are they somehow more perfect? So is my idea of this mug more perfect than this mug? And is that somehow connected to an intellectual sphere in the heavens? Things have essential natures. They have purpose. And so they develop in nature according to the purpose for which they were created. And so human beings have purposes, right? It's all animated by this design, this idea of design and moving towards an end. And human beings should order their affairs accordingly. This is where natural law comes from as well, is you look at final causes. What are the purposes of things? And then you arrange things in this world in order to align with those. And that's a kind of divine law. And things are knowable with certainty. If I'm an experienced person, I can know the essence of something I have been working on, engaging, studying. Once I know the essence of that thing, I can define it. And if I use proper reasoning, I can derive certain knowledge. Okay, these are some of the elements. Now I want to give you this picture. This is our new cosmic story. How different a universe, isn't it? If you look at the bottom, you see a time axis. There was no time axis on the geocentric universe. And as far as our scientific knowledge goes today, which changes, and I'll get to that, this is the picture we have for ourselves. The Earth hasn't always been there. It's not there until about 4.5 billion years ago, and then it arrives. And so I'm looking at the time. Let me keep going so I can wrap up with all of my ideas. Given this shift, as I brought this quote from Iqbal, the task before the modern Muslim is immense. He has to rethink the whole system of Islam without completely breaking with the past. And so I argue that a lot of what we're confronting in Muslim thought is being caused by a complete shift in the picture of the world, while we're trying to deal with specifics using tools and terms and concepts in the old world. And the thing is, we don't discard everything, but how do we establish continuity? Okay, so here's a huge diagram. It's called a big history timeline, and it places this story on this scale of the timeline of the universe. And you can see that there's an original moment, the Big Bang. There are interesting speculations about what happens before then, although we have no way to study that scientifically at this point. And then life, ultimately after the solar system develops life forms. And then there's evolution of life until we get to the modern human being. And you can put the history of the earth in a 24-hour clock. And if you look at this, human beings came on earth about a minute ago. If the earth came into existence 24 hours ago. And if you do the whole universe 24 hours ago, we've been here for a few seconds. And so at this point, I just wanted to put this up because I love this. هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. Has there not come a time on a human being when he was nothing to speak of, not even mentioned? So we're a pretty recent species according to time, and our existence therefore is quite precarious. So if I put the classical and the contemporary scientific worldviews side by side, you have static and no time. And in the contemporary side, you have a time and an evolving and a changing universe. There you have hierarchy. The heavens are completely different from the earth. Professor Musa tells the story, and I've heard it other places, where some alim, maybe there were more than one, said when they had claimed to have gone to the moon, when we went to the moon, this person said, how did we penetrate the ring of fire? Because at the edge, all fire goes up, and there should be theoretically a rim of fire before you get to the lunar sphere. And so they thought it was physically impossible to penetrate the ring of fire. And so you see, this is an example of thinking in old world terms and living in a new one. So the old world is hierarchical. This world is egalitarian. It's the same. The stars, the other galaxies even, we're all made of the same stuff. And we kind of change form one to the other as time flows. And so in that sense, everything is grounded in kind of either materialism or a kind of spirituality. There's a oneness. That actually helps us, perhaps, when we think of things like Tawheed. It could, but it requires new kinds of articulation. This universe, apparently, at least from within the science, you had teleology, you had purpose in nature. Now there's no purpose. There's no final cause. And things are, knowledge is not infallible. We don't know things with certainty. Our knowledge is fallible, and we know it from a certain perspective, and our perspectives change. This is a completely different worldview. And do you think it has to impact religious thought? Absolutely. So I put this up from Joseph Campbell. It's an interesting, little anecdote from his book. He worked on comparative mythology. And the anecdote pulls you in. He says, I was sitting the other day at a lunch counter that I particularly enjoy when a youngster about 12 years old, arriving with his school satchel, took the place at my left. Beside him came a younger man holding the hand of his mother, and those two took the next seats. All gave their orders, and while waiting, the boy at my side said, turning his head slightly to his mother, Jimmy wrote a paper today on the evolution of man, and teacher said he was wrong, that Adam and Eve were our first parents. You can see the tension in the children. And so the author, Joseph Campbell, who's hearing this, my Lord, I thought, what a teacher. And the lady 3 seats away then said, well, teacher was right. Our first parents were Adam and Eve. And then he says, what a mother for a 20th century child. It's an interesting conversation, isn't it? And what's interesting is that we're having this conversation until today. I just heard last week someone who said this exact same thing in different words. So I'm going to say just a little bit about, I want to bring this to life. You know how scientists look at this is they go and they dig deep into the earth and they find layers. And the deeper they go, they find different kinds of organisms. They're fossils. And the older you go, the less complex those fossils get. And you can actually age these very precisely. This is how they come up with geological, time scales based on the changing nature of the rock that they find and the kinds of things that they find in those rocks. And so humans, according to this, have appeared very recently. Okay, so here's the evidence. And, the earth is changing its shape over tens and hundreds of millions of years. This is one of the reasons we get earthquakes. They can study these things called tectonic plates. And I pulled this next image from the Khan Academy, where they go back in time and they look at how the same fossils are found maybe say on East Africa and in South America from way long ago. How could that be? Well, because the continents at that point were joined and at one point separated, and then they evolved separately. So it's a beautiful kind of science that has many different metrics and different disciplines contributing towards it. I was in South Africa actually talking about madrasa discourses and these kinds of ideas. And you go to Africa as the cradle of human civilization, and you go to these museums and they put the fossils on display. So this was nearly 2 million year old fossil skull, and it was uncovered of a certain kind of, animal that was related to us, uncovered in 2008 in the Cradles Malapa Nature Reserve. It is from one of two nearly complete fossil skeletons of a distant relative of humans. And how do they do this? Combining primitive and more modern human features. It's a snapshot of evolution in action. So they continue to discover these things. And I want to return and finish this anecdote. The youngster responded when his mother said, "Teacher was right. It's Adam and Eve." He said, "Yes, I know. I know that it was Adam and Eve. I'm not denying that. But I wrote a scientific paper." So he's got two sources of knowledge for the same issue of origins. And the question is, how do you reconcile them, right? And for that, this is Joseph Campbell. I was ready to recommend him for a Distinguished Service Medal, the child, from the Smithsonian Institution. The mother, however, came back with another. She said, "Oh, those scientists," she said angrily, "those are only theories. It's not real." And he was up to that one too. He said, "Yes, I know," with his cool and calm reply, "but they have been factualized. They found the bones." And so this is a kind of challenge we're dealing with. Shaojin, I know that I should be stopping, but I have just a few minutes to wrap.
Please continue. Please continue. We have time for you. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll
you can use the full hour even. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'll try and wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so. I'm winding down, but I'll give you this example. This ayah in Surah Yasin, وَالشَّمْسُ تَجْرِي لِمُسْتَقَرٍّ لَهَا. The sun runs, it moves, tajri. And how do we understand this? Because we see the sun moving, right? And so classical understandings of this was simply that, yes, it's moving in the sky and we are still. And so someone like Sheikh bin Baz, recently as, the second half, end of the 20th century, said that I'll show you shar'an and aqlan, that the earth is stationary and it's the sun that's moving. Aqlan is pretty clear. It doesn't feel like we're moving. Doesn't look like we're moving. If we were moving, we'd fall over. And there are other very smart reasons to think we're not moving. In the classical world, the scientists contemplated this question, and they said if we were moving around the sun, we should observe what's called stellar parallax. We should see the stars in the distance move in relation to the sun behind them. And we should be able to calculate this and say, they say we observe no motion. So there's only two possible conclusions. One, that we don't move. And the second conclusion is that they're so infinitely far away that we can't perceive the motion. And it turns out now we have instruments to measure it, that we are pretty far away and we can measure it. So our knowledge changed, right? But it's quite rational to think otherwise. And then someone like Anwar Shah Kashmiri comes and he says he accepts that, okay, fine, we move in relation to the sun, but the Quran is not speaking scientifically. The Quran is speaking from a human perspective on this question. The sun moves for us how we see it, not moves absolutely in a scientific sense. It was a very interesting move that he made, okay, in interpretation. And so what I'm trying to say is new knowledge drives new interpretation. And you have someone in the UAE, it's very interesting, Professor Qassoum, who writes on these questions. And here's one of his articles with Kalam Research and Media on Kalam's necessary engagement with modern science. And he says, look, big questions like cosmology, the structure of the universe is important, evolution, man's place in the universe. These are all questions that we need to rethink in light of new knowledge and our new cosmic story, as I've put it. And also divine action in the world. How does God interact with the world? Kalam engaged all of these questions in the past using categories of classical philosophy, but our categories are shifting. And so how do we engage the same questions in ways that would be convincing in light of our revelation today? But there's one place I'd like to add that I think there are also big questions in fiqh. And so in both theology, kalam, and in law and ethics, the new ways of thinking pose serious questions for us. So I'm going to give you three big questions and I'm done. One, if the Quran is perspectival when it comes to the cosmos, like the sun moves, but not actually moves in relation to the earth, it's the earth that moves around the sun, but it appears to us. And so the Quran is speaking from the way things appear to us. If the Quran is perspectival when it comes to the cosmos, could it also be addressing issues like gender and patriarchy and other social issues from the perspective of a certain time and place in history? I hope you get the question. This is a question that's been driven. You know, I just put a few books up that I'm more familiar with. There's more recent scholarship, it's ongoing, and a tremendous amount of literature that's accumulating that is really asking this question. I think that the body of scholarship makes sense in light of a shift in our cosmic story. And so those who are steeped in tradition, they look at the scholarship and they say it has nothing to do with Islam. They don't know how to think about Islam. And they're saying, well, no. We know Islam quite well, and they're right. But we're thinking about these questions in new ways. And so this is, and again, comes back to identity, right? Is things are hybrid. And so if you're situated in new context and confronted with new questions, you come up with new ways to think about things. And this is a big question, I think, that we have to contemplate. Second big question. If our picture of the world has changed before, how do we know it won't change again? Especially now that our knowledge is fallible. If we change everything that we thought was firm and fixed, then now we know it'll probably change again. And so what does this mean for theology, right? So before we thought the world was like this, and now we think it's like this. We'll think about it in different ways tomorrow. So how do we deal with this kind of contingency? lack of finality in thinking about the world and ourselves and our relation to scripture and divine commands. Big question number 3. If revelation is conditioned by history, meaning it speaks from a certain perspective, in this historical moment, people viewed things this way, and so revelation addressed them from the views that they had, then how do we reimagine the finality of prophethood? How is it that revelation is final when perspectives at the cosmic level were going to shift so much? This is, I think, an interesting theological question, and I leave you with this quote. This is the last slide of Allama Iqbal. I quoted him earlier. The Prophet of Islam seems to stand between the ancient and the modern world. So he was already involved in this rethinking in the early 20th century, the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. Insofar as the source of his revelation is concerned, he belongs to the ancient world, the source. Insofar as the spirit of his revelation is concerned, there's a lot of room here for interpretation, okay, and thinking about what this means. But insofar as the spirit of his revelation is concerned, he belongs to the modern world. So Iqbal found resources in revelation that helped him think about these new issues. In him, the Prophet of Islam, life discovers other sources of knowledge suitable to its new direction. The birth of Islam is the birth of inductive intellect. In Islam, prophecy reaches its perfection in discovering the need of its own abolition. So, a summary. I first talked about identity. Identities are complex, both of individuals and also of civilizations. Islamic civilization, Islamic tradition is a complex tradition. But one way to think about that tradition is as a great conversation with differences amongst those who participate in that conversation, deep differences. Nonetheless, all of them inhabited a kind of classical worldview that was tied deeply to ancient philosophy and Hellenistic philosophy. I highlighted that aspect. Other people could highlight other aspects of the hybridity and complexity and take this in other directions. Then I presented our new cosmic story with a new picture of the world and new ways of knowing it and inhabiting it. And that raised a series of big questions for us on theology and on law and on what it means to have religious knowledge when we know that our knowledge is fallible, and how do we think of the finality of prophethood in this context. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you so much for listening, if you were able to stay with me throughout this hour. I turn it back to Xiaojin.
Thank you very much, Professor Mahan, for this very rich and deep talk on Islam and our new cosmic story. In fact, myself, and I'm sure many viewers today, learned a lot from this great presentation. And in fact, we do have a question. If you have time, we can just go a little bit longer than expected the time. First of all, is let's get a little bit bring you or your talk down to earth. See, based on this, the great shift from classic worldview and to the modern cosmic story you presented. So how Muslims today, Muslim communities, Muslim world, Muslim intellectuals, and as an ordinary Muslim, how they should respond to this new reality?
Yeah.
And in particular, as you know, the World Muslim Community Council, this organization, we are hosting this event today, is the mainly are in try to taking care of the Muslim community in many non-Muslim countries, non-Muslim majority countries, where this Muslim actually every day I think they live in these two kind of worldviews you just presented. One is they are Muslim as identity, they kind of learn from this Islam, from this maybe classical worldview influenced Islam. But on the other hand, they are participating, contribute to the modern society, modern life, modern scientific learning. So how they can reconcile these two,
Right.
as a Muslim community member?
Well, this is a great question, and it's a question of identity. What I would say is that we need to be able to expand the boundaries of our communal identity, to embrace those who have new perspectives that are in conversation with our new cosmic story. Instead of drawing the boundaries in very conservative ways, where people who are thinking in new ways are considered outside Islam or not true Islam, and somehow then their membership in the community and standing is diminished. I think we need to stop that, and we need to have a more expansive view, and we need to embrace the richness of our tradition, both past and present. And in fact, what I would invite us all to think is that a great civilization doesn't think in one way. In fact, our greatness is in how we're able to manage differences between us. And so I would encourage everyone to be open-minded, to continue to think creatively, imaginatively, boldly about these questions. And for institutions and circles of authority that are there, instead of putting borders and safeguards, I mean, all communities and schools of thought have to do that, but to do it in a way like we did in the past, where there was a respectful way to agree to disagree, rather than a disrespectful way. So I hope that helps.
Yes, indeed, it is great advice. It is time for us to respect differences, to tolerate,
Yeah.
and to be open and to think the future of Islam and Muslim community. And maybe the last question or follow up with this one. I know you had a great experience with establishing or founding Muslim higher education institutions like Zaytuna College, or you have advised on the good project like madrasas, where you try to, if I understand correctly, you try to bring this scientific, modern, rational thinking to this traditional madrasa concentrated curriculum. So based on those experience, what advice or what suggestion you would give to the Muslim communities or Muslim members today to answer the questions you just raised?
Yeah. This is a very good question. What I would suggest is our educational systems tend to be formulaic, in that we want students to come to us so that we can tell them what to think, so that we can give them answers. But instead, we need to rethink our educational systems and reconfigure them for not what to think, but how to think. As you saw in my presentation, I gave us a framework, and then I raised some questions. I didn't try to say that here are the answers for everybody, and this is how you should think. But I invited us to think together. And I think our educational systems need to embrace more of that spirit, not to be completely relativistic and open-ended. You need a grounding. But we need a better balance, where we also have a degree of openness, so that we provide the students with the tools to be able to think for themselves, and we welcome them into a great conversation, a great civilizational conversation,
rather than indoctrinate them into thinking according to this or that school.
Right. So thank you very much, Dr. Mahan, for your great contribution to this topic. And I'm sure all the viewers has benefited from your talk. And thank you for all the viewers, and see you next time.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. Assalamu
Thank
alaikum.
you. Take care. Wa alaikum salam.